Podcasting is more than just talking, it's listening. BSing with Bob Schmidt.
The BS with Bob Schmidt podcast featuring entrepreneurship, business, and marketing. This week, talking with author, creator, and presentation innovator, Claudyne Wilder. Claudyne, thanks for joining us today. So presentations are something that I think that a lot of us struggle with. I tend to put too much stuff on my pages. I'm assuming that a lot of other people do as well. Is there really a proper way to put together a presentation?
There is. And the proper way is to put less on your slides and talk about it.
So it's storytelling?
You can think about a presentation as a story, perhaps. The whole thing is a story, right? Mm-hmm. So here's the problem, and here's how we fixed it, and here's a solution. And that's the story, the before, the plot point, and the after. And you have to think, how much detail do they need about each of those sections?
How did you find the love for doing presentations?
I just started years ago writing books on it. And really what happened is I was doing a lot of organizational development. Over and over again, people would say, well, we can't promote that person. They don't communicate well. Oh, they can't go to talk to upper management. They're terrible at it. And I started to realize that's a real problem many, many people have. I have some good ideas about how they can fix it. That's how it started, actually.
So it's basically something you thought you saw a problem and you decided to go ahead and work on fixing that?
Right. So, there are two sides to a presentation in my mind, like big sides. One is the data side, and that's what I call more of an executive summary, the details of it all. And that's for people who want, tell me this, and this. Then there's the storytelling side, which is the more emotional part, but also the part that can capture someone's imagination better than a lot of numbers. I do both of those in my work. I make people do an executive summary, like here's the focus, here's the benefits, here's the next steps. But I also want them to put in a story that gives people a vision, a quote, a movie of what they're suggesting. Let me give you a quick example. How's that? That might be the best way.
Perfect.
A story has a before, let's say. So someone says to me, "What do you do what's your work like?" And I say, "Let me tell you a story." So here's the before. I say, "I had someone come to me and he said, 'I'm just boring and my boss wants you to fix me.' I said, 'Well, boring how?' 'I'm just boring,' he said. She says, 'You have to fix me.' I asked him then, 'Well, can I see your slides to see what they're like?' 'No,' he says, 'she just says I'm boring.' But I said, 'Let me see your slides just in case.' That's the before. Now we come to the plot point. I looked at the slides and I thought, these are terrible. There's all these words. There's no images. I know he's talking to the vendor. There's nothing about the vendors in this. Then I called him and I said, 'Can I fix them? I know you're just boring, but let me just fix them.' And he agreed. And I fixed them. He came to my office and he practiced. Now we have the after. About 2 weeks after he gave his talk, he called me and he said, 'Guess what?' And I said, 'What?' He said, 'My boss says I'm not boring anymore.' And I said, 'Oh, did she notice your slides?' 'No,' he said, 'but it was great.' And then he said, 'And the vendors asked me so many questions that I finally had to tell them I had to leave.' Now, that's a story. There's a before, a plot point, and after. It's not a lot of things, but you see, it's just clearly stated. I didn't say a lot about before. That was enough, his boss said is boring. I didn't tell you how I fixed the slides and everything I did. And then after I just said, hey, I changed. Mm-hmm. And anybody can do that.
I just graduated from college back in April with an associate's degree in sales and sales management, and I had a difficult time, even though I was a radio guy, getting up in front of a group and giving a presentation. So if somebody that speaks for a living has a hard time getting in front of a group, how does somebody that doesn't have any background in talking in front of people, how are they supposed to get better at giving a presentation if it scares the hell out of them?
Well, there's a couple things. First, it scares them because they haven't rehearsed. The real issue, though, is they're not organized. I have introverts who come to my classes. In business, there's a lot of introverts. I've had a couple of people who actually were crying in my classes. They didn't want to come. But what they first need is organization, in my mind. They need organization. When we make an executive summary, and it's so clear of what they have to do. Okay, here's what you say. Here's the present situation we have. Here's the problems with it. Here's the solutions and the resources. They organize everything. And when people are organized, they're less nervous because they're not wondering what they're going to say next. They see the headlines and they know what to say. But then they have to rehearse. And most people, they don't rehearse.
Or they think they can wing it.
The problem is people aren't taught to rehearse. When I have a class and people say to me, "Oh, I get nervous," and I offhandedly say, "How many times do you practice?" "Oh, I just think about it in my head." And I say, "Well, you should be nervous. Why are you going to get up in front of a room, let's say 20 people, 30 people, 200 people, I don't know, and think you can do it right the first time out loud?"
So how many times legitimately should you go over it out loud before you give your presentation to a group?
It depends. I know my subject, and when I used to do a lot of talks at Mass General Hospital, I would do them almost once a month. But every time before I went, even though they were kind of the same, I would do the whole thing out loud once, and it was so boring. But I was good then, I wasn't thinking about what was next, how to organize. That was one time. Most people, one or two times, depending on if it's high-level executives, what are the stakes, right? How much what's at stake? So, for example, years and years ago, like 10 years ago, I was offered to be a vendor of choice in a big, big company. And that's unusual because I'm a sole proprietor. But I got through the proposals, and I was asked to come and give a talk. There were 3 vendors who were chosen to come and give a talk. That talk, I practiced out loud 18 times, I remember. I was hysterically nervous because I thought, these are really high stakes. I'm up against 2 other companies. I don't know what they're like. When I got there, I nailed that talk. I mean, not that I did what I planned exactly, but because I knew it, I could move this direction, that direction. I engaged everybody. I walked out of there and I said, that was a total success. I've had 10 years of business with this company. 10 years of business. I got it.
That's awesome. Well, you said something you hit it right on the head, though. You said it didn't go exactly as I planned. A lot of times that's where I get nervous. So I know that I sent you a copy of my presentation earlier, and the first 3 slides are just basically pictures. And I think to myself, what if I forget to say this information, or what if I don't give that information in that slide? And that's what screws me up.
Because the thing is, you don't know the point of that slide. You don't have on your slide the key point that then you can talk to.
Oh, so have a picture and a word or two?
You need a heading. You need an informative heading.
Oh,
on
okay.
each slide. Like, you have one that says, tell your story.
Right.
But what does that mean? Tell your story to 1 million people. Is it about how many people hear your story? Tell your story to gain credibility. You need the words, or you might say, tell your story for visibility and credibility. Now you have 2 words you can talk about.
Oh, so even though it's a map, I'm giving myself the in and the out of the map.
Right, because otherwise it's not so helpful, especially for somebody who's nervous. Because then you look at that and you go, what's it about? For me, you need informative headings. Because you have to think about, what is this slide about? Why? Tell your story why. And if you don't really make those messages clear, it doesn't leave much with your audience, but you said a lot of words.
That makes sense, because I look at those, like you said, tell the story. Okay, so now I'm telling a story about how when you're sitting on your grandparents' lap and your grandparents told you a story, and you remember that story, and that's what I'd like, my clients to eventually do, is to tell that story, so that way their listeners will be able to understand and remember the story like they remembered their grandparents' story. So maybe instead I should put a picture of Grandma and Grandpa and somebody sitting on the lap saying, remember the grandparents' story, or something like that?
Right, because now if that's your message, that you want the people to remember the story, that's, stories create memories.
Right.
That would be better even as a title, right?
Yeah. Just something simple, just changing a couple words, and then already I feel a little bit easier about doing that.
Right, because you have stories create memories. Now you have the before with the grandparents, the plot point they told you stories, and the after that you remember. We all have certain skills. So, for example, an introvert can give a strong executive presentation. I'm great at presenting, but I'm not a funny person just by nature, right? I took a storytelling workshop. It cost me a fortune. There were 40 people in a fortune. It was obvious to me after 4 days that I'm good at making ad-libs and things like that, but I'm not a person to get up and make everybody laugh instantly. I'm not that kind of person. And you could see some people, they just walk up there and you'd start laughing. I can't explain it to you. You have to understand what is knock it out of the park for you in your world. But you may never be good in front of 1,000 people entertaining them because that's not what you do. But you could be great at convincing doctors about a certain product because you're credible and trustworthy and you know how to give an executive summary and make your point. Like, do you notice my story was very short? I didn't go into a lot of details. Most people have too many details. So you want to think you have the high-level details, and then maybe you have another slide that's less details.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, online, if I put up a slide with 10 sentences on it to begin, that's the end of my talk. It's over already. Nobody's going to pay any attention after that. Like, this person's doing this to me, where if I put up an executive summary and said, here are the 3 points, here are the benefits, what I suggest, and here's the next steps, people go, oh, wow, they got to the point. I can listen a little longer.
Is there a different way of doing a presentation online as opposed to doing it face-to-face?
There's a different energy you have to have. There's several things I'd say you have to do. One is your voice. Since they don't see you, you have to have a very strong voice that pauses and that captures people's attention. The second is you have to, what I call, boss people around. For example, you have a slide that you're showing. You need to say, now look on the upper right and you'll see the numbers here. And on the next slide, if you look in the middle, you'll see the image that I believe is the most important one we show for the product. Because if you don't boss people around, they'll go multitask somewhere else.
Well, back in the radio days, we used to call that being a boss jock. You tell somebody what to say or what reaction they should have, and it worked. I mean, people would do that. So it follows through the same when you're actually making a presentation across the country or across the world.
Well, think about it. I'm sitting here, right, and I've got, you can't see me, and you're talking. I got a lot of things going on, looking at my emails, whatever. And you say, now, Claudyne, if you look over there, and I'll go look.
Uh-huh.
If you keep talking, well, da-da-da-da-da, and you never say, Claudyne, look here, or as you see this, or ask me a question, well, what do you think about that? You're not engaging me in any manner.
So it's as important to get people engaged in an online presentation, or maybe even more so than somebody that's face-to-face.
Right, because face-to-face they have to kind of behave.
Mm.
But online, if you just talk and you do ums and rights and go on and on, I'm not going to pay any attention. It's boring. And plus, it's not engaging.
Right.
If you keep saying, now, look here, do you think, are you surprised at the competition numbers? If you keep asking me questions, changing the pace somehow, I want to show you a half-a-minute video. Now, look at this. And you do all these things, you're engaging me.
How do you engage with more than one person when you're not face-to-face or when you can't see if they're even, if their eyes are even open?
That's why you have to engage with your voice, with pauses, with asking them questions, and with pointing to things. I like to think that after about a minute or two in your talk, you need to say, okay, I want to ask all of you a question. Are you surprised at what I'm suggesting that we do? And you wait. Now I'm telling you that our 15-minute conversation, I expect you to interact with it.
How long should an effective presentation last?
I think people overestimate people's ability to listen, quite honestly. All the business things I've listened to over the years, people go on for 40 minutes. It's ludicrous. You can't remember all that stuff. Like 20 minutes in my mind. And when I've worked with people in business, they come in and they have a 40-minute presentation. I had one guy who had 50 slides. By the time we finished, he had 15, and it was 10 minutes.
And it probably had a better closing ratio than his 50-slide presentation.
Well, the funny thing, the wonderful thing about that was we worked on his before he came to class. And I didn't know what happened. And he said in class that he used to take the 50-minute version and talk to these executives to get them interested in his idea. And nobody ever, said much, right? But when he did the 10-minute version, people said, oh, here, go talk to so-and-so, and I really like this idea. They were willing to pass him on. People are overwhelmed, and they don't want to be overwhelmed with you, so give them less, and then they can say, oh, tell me more about it.
Right. Well,
right? It's like, it's just, think about our lives. There's too many things everywhere. And so why do we think somebody's going to give us total undivided attention, or that they even have it to give us, right?
So do you have to learn how to think on the fly and edit on the fly when you're giving a presentation and know what to kind of bring out, what to kind of leave behind?
If you have your executive summary to start, then you have your details about different points in the summary. And at that point, you might say, I'll leave out this slide. They don't need it. I'll put this in. They want the numbers. It depends what you want. So it's not, for me, it's more of a conversation. So let's say there's a performance presentation and there's an interactive presentation.
Uh-huh.
Performance is you get up, you do your spiel, and you sit down. And you say, okay, questions. Interactive is you get up, you talk a bit, and you say, any questions here, any comments? And you wait to see what people say. Then you decide where to go next.
So that's what you mean by when you say executive summary?
An executive summary would be the one-slide summary that you would give about your talk when you start. So, for example, I was looking at yours, and I was thinking, okay, the question you have in your short presentation is how to tell your story to the world, a podcast or a microcast.
Mm-hmm.
And then you say, then your first point is podcast. This is how long it is, and this is what people listen. Here's the benefits. Microcasts. This is a smaller version, and here are the benefits. That's your first slide.
It sounds so simple.
It's simple if you follow the process.
Right.
It's complicated, time-consuming, and frustrating if you don't.
Now, I know that when we were kind of talking to each other back and forth on LinkedIn, you'd mentioned that you've got something that nobody else has, a way for people to actually get better at doing presentations.
Yes. So in my Get to the Message workshop for years, I would have people send out a Word document to their colleagues and their boss. And it was a questionnaire in Word, and the boss would check things off, good at delivery, too many details, 25 questions.
Mm-hmm.
People would come to my class with these, the stack of filled out surveys, and they would say, I wish somebody told me this a long time ago. And some people would say, if I'd have known this before I went to the board meeting last week. And that was fine, but it was a little cumbersome, right? Because how could you compare when you had 8 surveys? It was complicated. So 4 years ago, I started making an online presentation survey and coaching tool. And what it is, it's my survey online that anybody can use. So let's say you go, Bob, and you give a talk somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
You go to Torchmetrics, you get the link, you give everybody in your audience a link, they get the survey, they click the right boxes, and you get to see the results from everybody in your audience. And let's say you get pretty good, they like, you're energetic, you make eye contact, but they all say too many details. Well, you go, what do I do about that? What you do is you click the action steps in Torchmetrics, and it tells you how to fix it. It's an online tool to get feedback so that then you know what you should fix.
Ah.
Because, people will say to you, good job, when they think, I wish you'd have stopped talking 10 minutes ago. So what it does is it gives your audience a credible way to give feedback to you that's non-judgmental, but that's based on the best practices of presenting.
Right.
And it's great because people don't even know what to tell you sometimes. They know something didn't work, but they don't know, pausing. No, they never pause. Filler words. They say right all the time. And it's an easy way for somebody to give a person feedback.
Have you had pretty good success with this?
I've had great success with my clients. I use it with my clients, and now I need to market it to the world because I know it works. I know people love it. So now I need to get it out in the world. I use it with my clients at this point.
Right. I think it would be something even good for kids in school, especially college students that are learning how to do presentations and get up in front of groups, to have the ability to have somebody be honest with you without doing it out loud, you know?
You're right. And, it's an interesting problem because I've taught at some colleges here, gone in and done some work with MBA students, and I've been shocked at how poor they do things sometimes because they really haven't got that kind of feedback.
What is a typical problem that somebody has, Claudyne, when it comes to giving that presentation? The too much information, or the droning on and on, or no eye contact, or pausing weird places, or the little uncomfortable giggle?
The worst problems I see, because in my survey in companies, anybody, in a company when I do a workshop of 10 people, I get to see the results of the group. I don't see the individual results, but I can give the group results to a company and say, this is how your team of 10 are perceived by the outside world. We have 60 or 70 surveys that people have given back. And what I see as the major problems with most people is there's too many details, there's too many slides, and worse, there's not a call to action. You can be an okay presenter, let's say. You don't have to be energetic. If you make a good call to action in business, and you make it, and the same if you're selling something and you're sincere, trustworthy, have integrity, and you make a call to action about what's expected and you're organized, that's fine. But half of these people are not making a call to action in a meeting. The other one that's a surprise is a lot of times, maybe half, people say the information's not that relevant to them.
Well, I'm guessing that everybody listening to this podcast finds relevance in it because it's difficult to, first of all, get in front of a group and do the presentation, and secondly, to find out more information on how we can become better at our presentations. I'm going to ask you for our call to action. What's our next step here, Claudyne?
Well, let's see. I would say your call to action with your podcasts and your microcasts is to get out there and give people an option in your presentation and get them to want to do it. So when I look at the presentation you had, I said you need a call to action at the end. Mm-hmm. And so my call to action would be to get people to go use torch metrics, because I believe that will give them the feedback they need so they can become better presenters.
And how do we find torch metrics?
Online, torch metrics. That's it.
That's it. Torchmetrics.com.
Yep. And the reason it's a funny name, right? But I decided a torch lights the way, in the dark. So what I felt is the metrics you get, and plus people can write notes to you too in the surveys, but the metrics you get light the way to how you could be more successful. So we came up with torch metrics.
The BS with Bob Schmidt podcast is brought to you by Orange Computer. Find them online at orangecomputerlax.com. And by Tri-State Sound and Light. Find them online at tristatesound.com. Tell your story with microcasts by podcastforhire.com. The BS with Bob Schmidt podcast is a podcast for hire production.